You're kind of cheating out like this. We're kind of talking like this. That's our camera right down there. You're looking at me, but you know, every once in a while you can like look at them like, you know what I'm talking about? You know what I mean? So it's kind of like you're talking to me, but we're in a group of people. And I'm Mark S. King, and we are back with our live streaming of HIV is Not a Crime here at the Indiana University. I'm sorry I had to cut you short. Vanita Ray from Southern AIDS Coalition, an attorney and a longtime advocate for HIV criminalization.
That's right.
So we saw that survivors panel of people earlier, and I think a lot of people who are new to this might see that and freak out a little bit, like, oh my gosh, should I disclose to everybody I ever meet about my HIV status? How do I protect myself? Should people sign contracts? You know, that sort of thing. As an attorney in this issue, what kind of advice do you have for people like that? And are they right to be concerned?
Okay, well, first of all, I'm not giving legal advice. But I happen to be a woman living with HIV too, so this is personal to me, and I wish I had a one black and white answer. But the fact is, times are still rough. Most of what we saw today was about disclosure. Laws are based around either disclosure, exposure, or transmission. None of those cases up there were about transmission. So for some of us who really want to protect ourselves, I happen to disclose, but that's because I found a safe way to do it. We do know it puts people's lives at danger sometimes, so disclosing helps. Some people are doing affidavits. Some people are doing little Facebook videos.
Now, when you say you found a safe way to do it, do you mind if I ask what you mean by that?
Yeah, well, I have not been in a position, I disclosed before sex, so I have not been put in a position where I felt an imbalanced power of power or anything, and I've always felt, for me, that it was better to do that. I can do it in public when other people are around, not, you know, off by our side. I do it before too much has happened, although everybody doesn't have to do that. It's a very personal thing, but some people do a little Facebook thing or text each other and keep texts, so there's so many ways to do it, and unfortunately we're still in times that some type of proof may be necessary because for whatever reason the burden tends to be on people living with HIV versus other folks. So I wish it would change. We're fighting to change it because the responsibility should be shared, but we're just not there yet.
Nana Devi had some really strong, Nana Khanna had some really strong comments to make about the imbalance of power, even within those of us who are activists.
Yes.
You know, my activism might get more attention, or I might have more resources being a privileged white gay man, as opposed to you or somebody else working in this field. Do you see that? Do you see people working to try to correct that, especially in criminalization when we're talking about a real imbalance of who's being prosecuted?
Absolutely. One of the things we did here at this HINAC for the first time, we held a Black United Leadership Institute because we do know there is real imbalances of power, structural, systematic, black and brown folks being the ones who are most living with HIV, clearly the ones who come into contact with the criminal justice system the most, and so trying to empower those of us living with HIV, those most impacted, and getting them in the room in numbers because organizations and otherwise tend to speak from other perspectives, white gay males or others that don't represent and can't speak for the voices of those folks most impacted. So yes, that's part of what we're working on.
You know, I was at last week, they're doing some announcements, so I think we're going to be safe for a couple of minutes to wrap this up. I remember from last conference of HIV is Not a Crime, there was a real challenge to the white membership there from people of color about our space and our safety. It kind of threw people off a little bit, like, oh, who's being challenged here and why? But it was important, and it was thrilling for me to see people stand their ground.
And I thank you for what you wrote later, but HIV is a racial justice issue. You just can't get away from that. It impacts black and brown folks the most. We need our allies and other folks, but sometimes we need y'all to listen.
Thank you so much. We're going to return to the program of our live stream event of HIV is Not a Crime, sponsored by the Positive Justice Network.
My name is Christina Adeleke, and I'm on staff at the North Carolina AIDS Action Network, and I'm really excited to be here. I just wanted to introduce the rest of the panel. At the end, we have Lee Storrow, we have Billy Willis, we have Karen McGee, and we have Terl Gleason. And we're all from North Carolina, and we all were a part of the process in modernizing our HIV criminal law. And we're really excited to be here. But as you know, there are only 5 of us here, but it took more than 5 of us to get this done. And we are lucky enough to have some other North Carolina advocates here in the House who are part of the process. So if you are able, please stand or raise a hand if you are there. Hi, everyone. Hello, hello, hello. Yeah, Alicia and Wanda were actually a part of our task force that were active in this process. So I just wanted to kind of start off and just give a little context as to the state of North Carolina and the state of advocacy, the history of advocacy that we've had. As people may know, North Carolina is depicted as a very conservative state. If you've heard on the news, they've made some ripples for some of the legislation and for some of their tactics currently, but that's been a part of our history, and we've been able to have a lot of successes in the midst of that. In 2010, we were actually able to advocate with the General Assembly to remove the wait list that we had on our AIDS Drug Assistance Program, which is now called the HIV Medication Assistance Program. But yeah, we had one of the longest wait lists in the state, and as you know, that's not okay. So we advocated and worked to remove that waiting list, and we have not had a waiting list since, which is really great. And we built on that success, and we were able to allow for the HMAP money now, which was solely used just for medications and the doctor visits that were associated with that. We were able now to advocate with the GA to allow some of those funds to be used for premium assistance, so people were able to get full comprehensive health care coverage, which is huge, especially now in Trump's America. We were able to do that, but we were able to do that in North Carolina, and that's we've been able to make big things happen despite our political realities. So that's kind of the context that we're working in. And prior to the 2016 election, when we were thinking ahead and trying to figure out what policy initiatives we wanted to take on as a state and as an organization, HIV criminalization was always on our list. Fast forward, the election happening, and then we're like, oh, we may not have the luxury to do this. But we were able to, pull a fast one to some degree. In North Carolina, our HIV criminal law is unique in the fact that most states have their own, they have the criminal law, the HIV criminal law already housed in the criminal law itself. And in North Carolina, our HIV criminal law is actually housed in our control measures, which there are control measures for HIV, herpes, a bunch of other things too, that are mandated by the state. And so when it comes to making changes to the control measures or the rules, we wouldn't have to necessarily go through the GA or to make those changes. We were able to go to the North Carolina Commission on Public Health, which there are an administrative rulemaking body. And they're appointed by the governor and the North Carolina Medical Society. So every 10 years, these control measures, or all the control measures rather, are up for review. And they'll usually go in and try to make some edits, fix things here, fix things there. But with the HIV control measure specifically, there had not been changes made for decades. And as you know, the state of HIV has changed a bit in these past decades. We are in a way better place, and it's really exciting to see all of the advancements that we've made, but our laws were not reflective of that at all. So at the onset of this process, the North Carolina Department of Health and Human Services they knew that in 2017 was going to be the year to make updates and changes, and they were initially only wanting to make changes to related to organ donation, which was kind of based on a federal law that was passed that legalized scientific research and organ donations for people living with HIV. So they were just wanting to make the state law reflect the federal changes. But in North Carolina, the advocates were very passionate about this, and we were wanting to make even more changes. So we were able to do that and to not only focus on the organ donation, but to talk about disclosure and to talk about condom usage as well, which was really great. In addition to that, which helped make our climate a bit better, even though the 2016 election happened and on the national level things changed, in North Carolina we were actually able to elect a Democratic governor, which really was awesome because the governor was able to select staff members at DHHS who were very supportive of our work, and that combined with certain people retiring from DHHS, they were ready to go out with a bang, so that allowed us to kind of ride that momentum and get them on board to make the changes. So once we had all of that in place, we wanted to move as quickly as possible, but as strategically as possible to get these changes, because we knew that in North Carolina, getting anything passed is a struggle, but especially with this topic and people's lack of information, we knew that it could be really tricky for us. So we decided to create a task force of people mostly consistent of people living with HIV, but then also doctors, service providers, and other lawyers, other advocates who were passionate about this to get this process started. So I'm going to pass this off to Kara, who's going to talk more about the task force and the work that we did.
Thanks, Christina. So just to give you a little background about me and my involvement in the task force, I am a physician assistant, and I work in a clinic that provides medical care and other service for people living with HIV. And so I was asked to be a part of this task force, and the real purpose of it, of the task force, was to determine what the goals for modernization are in North Carolina and exactly what it was that we wanted to accomplish by modernizing the North Carolina control measures. And then we reviewed numerous drafts and the changes in the language that were made, and we did that as a group via regular conference calls. And so we would review a draft, everyone would give their comments, the writers, who were essentially two attorneys who were helping with a lot of the legal language that was required, would go back, create another draft, we would review it again, and it was sort of an iterative process of multiple draft reviews until we came up with what we thought would be a good final draft. We also needed to engage the North Carolina Department of Health and Human Services, and that was a really important part of the role of the task force. And that meant that we had to attend meetings with them and also with the North Carolina Public Health Commission as well. And then finally, participate in community education so that we were making sure that what we were doing wasn't in a silo, but rather that we were being inclusive and making sure that people in the community understood what our goals were and also had some input into the changes. And so just about a year ago, in July of 2017, the task force developed a final proposed control measures draft, and we met with the North Carolina Department of Health and Human Services staff to review that. And actually, Tammy was able to join us by telephone, which was really, really helpful. And that was a really productive meeting, and they were very supportive of what we were proposing in terms of changes to the North Carolina control measures. Under the leadership of the North Carolina AIDS Action Network, we then held 3 community meetings to educate partners around the state, including in Asheville, Winston-Salem, and Fayetteville, and those were done in coordination with other local groups like the Campaign for Southern Equality, the North Shore LGBT Center in Winston-Salem, and other local AIDS service organizations and community health centers. And the meetings really were intentionally casual, snacks, dinner, overview of the proposed changes that allowed folks really to give us their feedback and ask questions in a comfortable situation. And then one of the final things that the task force did was to create a letter. So then what happened was after the North Carolina Department of Health and Human Services signed off on the draft that we proposed, then it was released for public comment in September of last year. And in addition to the public hearing that Billy's going to discuss next, community members could submit online their comments about the proposed changes. And so along with that, around the time that was released for public comment, we created an electric sign-on letter in support of the control measures and asked individuals and other organizations to sign on to that letter in order to show that there was really broad support for modernizing the North Carolina control measures.
All right, I'm Billy. Kind of building on what Kara had said, we did have a big campaign, but it was quiet as well. So a lot of members in the community felt like they weren't being heard, so we had to hear their concerns and try to balance everything out. And in the end, a lot of people were happy, but we felt we still have a lot more to go with. So going in on public hearing day was very nerve-wracking. We had speakers from the ACLU, the Latino Commission on AIDS, and INCAN. But surprisingly, everybody was in support that day. So, and also, the question earlier about where someone's role is that is good at storytelling, these are the good days for that. I think we had stories from Charlotte all the way to the beach in North Carolina, and they were all very moving. So I was very, very happy with that day.
Well, if you want to talk before we jump to the end, you came and spoke about your story that day at the hearing. Do you want to share a little bit about that?
Well, I don't usually like to talk about myself or that story, but as a young leader with HIV and a young person of color, I am white and Native American. It was important for people in Raleigh, that's very far away from the tribal lands that I was raised on, to hear how HIV actually does affect us. You know, as minorities, that's not, commonly heard of. Native Americans, millennials, they think a lot of us are vapid. So, to see them uncomprehending and putting themselves in the shoes of finding out, after 6 years that your partner was exposed to HIV, and that's how you were transmitted HIV. It made a lot of things click for them, and to hear, the religious differences from Raleigh, which is not really in the Bible Belt, going down to south near the border, which is in the Bible Belt. We don't talk about condoms or HIV or sex, and especially gay sex. So just to be able to bring that out there to them, it was very rewarding, and I think that was definitely my favorite experience. And also, if you guys are planning on doing this, you're not going to be able to get everybody on the same consensus, but it's very important to get everybody centered, especially for days that you're doing stuff like this, public hearings, because although it may not seem like you're on the same team sometimes, we are all in this together. As people living with HIV, we definitely need to stick together doing this stuff.
Yeah. Go ahead, Terl.
Hello, everybody. My name is Terl Gleason. I am from Greensboro, North Carolina. I'm 56 years old, and I've been living with HIV a long time. And living with HIV is not a crime. I ran into this, and I'm going to hit my little highlights, Lee. Don't get worried. I really want to thank the SERO Project, and I want to thank Tammy Haught in particular. Yeah. I heard about this topic in 2013, and when I heard about it, I didn't believe it. When I was exposed to the personal stories of people, then I started believing it, and I couldn't believe it. So then I started doing everything I could with SERO Project. They have spent thousands on me, sending me to seminars, doing everything I could with them. They have invested tens of thousands in the state of North Carolina. So I want to thank those people. I want to thank all of you here, every one of you sitting in that seat. You're a leader. And working with leaders is tough. As Billy mentioned, with consensus, it's hard to get. We ran into very challenging problems. We had a lot of problems. We thought it was going to blow up at any minute. We're trying to get this thing done because it's going to be at the right time in the right place, and we're trying to keep it quiet. We don't want the legislators to find out. So we didn't have, we faked a little consensus. Sometimes you can reach consensus, but I would encourage all of the leaders here to really know what solidarity means. And solidarity means that you're going to come together on one issue. I may not agree with any of you on 99 things, but on the modernization of these HIV laws, we all agreed. So please take that home with you. That was something we should have trained everybody on when we started, is solidarity. I can't stand them. I don't agree with them. But we're going to work together on this one thing. Now back to what I'm supposed to be doing. We had a task force, and we were great. We had great community members. We had great legal experts, medical experts. The health department was at the right place at the right time. I was part of a lot of things, but because of my solidarity principles, I had to step back from a few things, because when some people saw me, their blood pressure was going to go up 200 points. And we didn't need that. We had to get to the goal. This is not about me. This is about my story and making it work for all of us. So my part in it, in this outline, was at the, Commission for Public Health meeting. And this was a meeting where we had 10 the commissioners for the public health. They voted on this. We felt good about all of this. There was one person that voted against it, and I was very angry about that.
Let's be clear, just for the record. That individual abstained rather than voting against. So technically, not a single member of the governing body voted against it.
See the importance of having a well-rounded group. I know how to work with the living with HIV people. We all work together. So it's correct. And so that bothered me, because I didn't understand why they could not agree with us. But nevertheless, that meeting, it passed. And so it was a good meeting. I spoke at that meeting. I said a few things that were in my heart. And moving forward, use your stories. Use your stories. Get all you can from people. Your stories are what's going to make this change. With our task force, we were always, the people living with HIV, we were more than 50% of the group. We were always consulted first. Our approval was needed, it was required, and we were respected. So we were really lucky in that part of it. The education, we lacked a little bit. We're having to catch up on education because this is a challenging thing. It's a new concept for a lot of people. Thank you.
So I'm going to provide kind of a quick summary of what the change law that went into effect in January actually did, and then talk a little bit about our next steps. For folks who don't know me, I'm Lee Storrow. I'm the executive director of the NC AIDS Action Network. Was really honored to work with my colleague Christina, our volunteers, medical providers, and a really broad coalition. That this is just a small number of the folks who worked on it to help change our law last year. This is a summary postcard we made in consultation with a nonprofit called the Western North Carolina AIDS Project based in Asheville that does our best to take a really clunky, really dense law into something that's actually understandable for folks living with HIV. So at a really high level, the law that went into effect in January 1 states that if you are someone living with HIV and are virally suppressed and been in care for 6 months, that legally you do not have to disclose your status and that legally you don't have to use a condom. Yeah, we can take applause for that. We were also proud, though, to change a number of other factions of the law that we think do also really have an impact on folks living with HIV across the spectrum. So if you are not virally suppressed, but your partner is living with HIV or your partner is on PrEP, you legally don't have to use a condom. I think one of the most powerful moments I had during this campaign was meeting with a group of people living with HIV at a support group. And I had a couple start almost to laugh at me when I told them that, you know, this was as we were working on the changes. Prior to the change, they as a couple, 2 individuals living with HIV, legally in the state of North Carolina were required to use a condom. And like sort of watching their emotions of sort of starting in humor and then really realizing just how horrific that was and the requirements that our state government was putting in place in folks was really powerful. And as we referenced earlier, we also technically changed our state law to comply with the HOPE Act to allow for organ donation. And the final thing I'll note that I don't think is reflected on this postcard is that we took out some really stigmatizing language from state law. Our state law had reference to individuals who were retarded, and it also referenced specifically infecting people living with HIV. So to be able to strike that language and to have actually our DHHS staff champion that was really powerful, I think, for all of us who were there at that commission meeting in November, which was exciting. 2 just couple quick notes about the process. It was a reminder to me at that meeting how powerful representation is. Our Democratic governor, Roy Cooper, who was elected, had appointed to the Public Health Commission a medical provider who was an openly gay man who ran a medical clinic in the eastern part of North Carolina who'd served on Equality North Carolina's board of directors. And so in that meeting, for him to be at the table and say, you know, from my personal experience and the value of this work, was just a reminder that having diversity within all of our governing bodies and elected leaders is really powerful. And then I'll just note that a body called the North Carolina Rules Review Commission had to review the changes as well. That was largely a technical procedure. In December, they voted unanimously to pass the law, which allowed it to go into effect in January. Just a couple things to note in terms of lesson learned and next steps. I think actually a lot of my colleagues have alluded to some of this already, and it felt consistent with some of the conversation that I heard from California as well. This work is really challenging, and a lot of individuals have a lot of different perspectives, and a lot of stakeholders have viewpoints that are really, really important. I think you've probably sort of alluded to and heard the fact through this presentation that because we were not running a legislative campaign that went through the General Assembly, we were strategic in having a process that was slightly quieter than I think some folks were used to in terms of an advocacy campaign. You know, doing this work and walking through the halls of the General Assembly in North Carolina, I am frequently reminded that we have some leadership who is not always supportive of public health efforts, of LGBTQ rights, of a lot of the things we care about. And specifically after our legislature intervened when Charlotte, our local municipality, tried to pass a pro-trans bill to provide broad accommodations for individuals. I think a lot of folks know that we received national attention when our state legislature intervened and repealed the bathroom bill. We were reminded that we have a legislature that can sometimes be vindictive and sometimes come in and take away sort of rights that have been granted by other bodies. At the same time, though, we had advocates who really wanted to engage in this work and who really wanted to provide feedback. And I think all of us looking back, you know, want to be thoughtful about how we chose to move forward and think about if there were ways that we could have been more open while still being strategic. And I think that's kind of that tightrope balance that a lot of us are walking, is how do we engage the most number of stakeholders and know that this is like a really tough topic to message around. We actually, at the start of this year, have been intentionally doing our own proactive media work on this. So we put out a piece that Christina wrote in Q Notes, which is our LGBTQ newspaper based in Charlotte, that we can provide copies with folks. Feel free to talk to myself, Christina, or Tammy if people want to see that. That intentionally allowed us, for the first big media piece about this, to tell the story the way we wanted to. And I'm actually really glad we had that opportunity to kind of set the narrative in a way that made sense for us, because that allowed us to use that piece to share with other folks and reporters. And as the year goes on, we're going to really ramp up public education. But again, because of kind of the challenge of doing this work in a southern state and a conservative state, really want to tailor our initial media to people living with HIV, the LGBTQ community, and medical providers, and make sure the stakeholders who are the most knowledgeable and who need this information actually the most get it before we unintentionally awaken a sleeping dragon somewhere else. And I'll just note that I think we have a real opportunity to keep the conversation going because of the process we had this year. Our Department of Health and Human Services staff were really remarkable in doing this work. Christina alluded to the fact that a long time, the head of our communicable disease branch intends to think about retirement in the next couple of years, and she really, I think, felt emboldened as she ended her career to think about, how can I do something big? And this is a moment in time that was unique, and that she had been a champion for us in that role for decades that we didn't want to lose. But we also know that there's some things we would like to see changed in this law and further revisions and updates made. And going through this process this year allowed our DHHS staff to be so much more educated on it that we have room to think about additional changes and additional ways to make it more progressive and accessible to the needs of the HIV community. And I think the last thing is we also are being more strategic and more aggressive in terms of educating our elected officials. I've spoken with about 4 members of our majority party, of the Republican Party in the General Assembly, who are the folks who are the most educated on HIV. And I can tell that being able to tell them about the story and about sort of the success of the story, I think really makes them feel confident in the work in a way that might not have happened if we were sort of coming to them at the early stages of the process. I'll invite specifically folks who may be living in the South to join us a week and a day from tomorrow is HIV Speaks on Jones Street, which is the statewide HIV Treatment and Prevention Advocacy Day in North Carolina. We are really intentionally this year maybe not going to dive deep into the control measures, but dive deep with our elected officials into viral suppression, into the state of HIV, into PrEP, into U equals U, to make sure that we're doing a really good job to make sure our elected officials, if they do hear about this, if they do feel pushback, have had information from the HIV community as well. So I think with that, I'm going to conclude my remarks. I'm not sure where we are on time, so I'll refer to Allison and Christina about next steps.
Did you have anything else you wanted to say?
No, okay. I was good. I don't know if you wanted to do questions or if we have time for that.
That's what I'm going to try and figure out.
Okay.
I also wanted to acknowledge Carolyn McAllister and Allison Rice from Duke Law School. Got to have some shout out for the Legal Beagles folks. You did phenomenal work in North Carolina. You should be very proud. I'm so happy you were here to share all of that with us. It's an incredible process and a huge success. We're running a little bit behind, but if there are 1 or 2 questions, including from our live stream audience, I think I'm going to keep it to 2 if I can, and then we'll get the next panel up here. Please.
Hi, thanks. Laurel Sprague. I really appreciate the work, and particularly in this difficult environment that you found yourselves in. I couldn't help but notice that the law is different for people who are virally suppressed than for those who are not. And I imagine you had some hard conversations about that. It's a bit chilling for me to see that as a precedent. So I'm curious how that decision was made. I'm sure it was not an easy decision and one that you have to live with. And I'm also curious if the state of North Carolina now accepts that if it's going to treat people differently if they're virally suppressed versus if they're not virally suppressed, that they absolutely have an obligation to ensure that everyone has good treatment, full care, everything they need in order to be healthy as people living with HIV. Thanks.
And if I may, going off of what Laurel said, my question was very similar to Laurel's. I mean, everyone knows I'm a big supporter of U equals U and how it changed my life and made me to live life again. But what kind of conversations did you all have, behind these closed or in these meetings involving how we're disparaging and already marginalizing populations that are already severely marginalized in these U equals U times and conversations. Could you just give us an idea like how those conversations went and what y'all did and what y'all plan on doing in the future to just get rid of the law completely? So,
thank you. Go ahead.
I mean, I can share some initial thoughts and then open it up to others. You know, figuring out sort of the dynamic and the specifics of the law over the year, I think, was one of the hardest things that our task force and our broader network had to deal with. You know, I will say that if I was the sole decider about North Carolina's HIV control measures, we wouldn't have that distinction in place based on viral suppression and would be looking at different factors. I'm not the sole decider, and we had to sort of exist in, as we described, I think, a challenging environment, and particularly one with local health directors and public health staff who we were able to move to be really on board and understanding that viral suppression piece, but who are just still struggling. And I think we can keep moving them along, but are going to keep struggling with the viral suppression, the non-virally suppressed community. What I will specifically say is, as we had a principle, is we were committed that we were not going to make our law worse for anyone in the act of changing it, right? So our old law, regardless of if you were virally suppressed or not, made non-disclosure and non-condom usage a misdemeanor. And so let's say we were a scenario where the law was proposed to change so that non-virally suppressed individuals would be charged with a felony, right? Like that would have been a non-starter and an absolute no-go for our coalition. So thinking about how we could move in a big way this work forward because of the unique moment in time we had, and I think the really challenging political environment was important. And as I alluded to, I think that we can keep moving our folks forward, and particularly seeing this law come and be successful is actually going to help pit us, better position us for success for a future revision by the Commission for Public Health in a couple years than if we hadn't gone through this process this year.
Oh, go ahead.
I need to chime in. Thank you for the question. You know, the people living with HIV, this is the straw that about broke the camel's back. This is where we really started having, you know, some major breakdowns that we lived through, you know, and because we were very aware that this is going to set a precedent for those who are suppressed and those who are not virally suppressed. And it was a big discussion. And we lived through that, but it was very, very hard. It was very hard because we knew what we were doing. And we were in a situation where we had an opportunity to move forward for 62% of the people who were virally suppressed, of the 36,000 living with HIV in North Carolina. We had that opportunity. And then we also were very aware that we are discriminating against those, for whatever reason, are not able to reach viral suppression. And the numbers that break down in North Carolina are there's about 7,000 of those. Now, some of those may have been in care and dropped out of care. They may receive stigmatizing care. There may be racism going on. You know, you got 80 health departments. A lot of them are rural. So, because 4,000 of the people living with HIV don't even know that they're living with HIV, 4,000 people in the state. So this was very, very hard, Laurel, and it's a great question. And basically, we're just going to have to move forward. We had to understand that these gains are incidental, or not incidental, but they're in increments. It gave us courage to go on. Part of the meeting at the commission meeting that voted, this helped us get what we needed because we are going to be reaching out to these people. We need to find these people. We're hoping that it will help everyone see what the problems are with HIV, not only in North Carolina, but nationwide, of why we're not in care. So that is the goal, and thank you for asking the question. Was it answered?
Other than whether the state...
Yeah. I was going to address what the state...
Thank you.
I think you asked about what the state is doing, and I think it was very intentional that the leaders of the Department of Health and Human Services were very clear that by by doing it this way, we could actually use this in a way to our advantage to help really impact the cascade of care in North Carolina. And so, that we could use this as a way to say, there are a whole group of people who we need to find and get in care, and we need the resources for that. And so thinking about it from a sort of public health perspective, I think that thinking is right. Again, we wanted it to be, the law to be more broad, but I think in some ways we can actually use this to our advantage in North Carolina in terms of advocating for resources to improve care. And we have a good care system in North Carolina. So that's how it would be addressed.
And I'm sorry, we're not going to be able to take more questions. We're running on time, but the North Carolina panel folks will be here. I just wanted to say two things. I know that this is a tender and complicated situation with viral non-suppression, non-viral suppression. But two things that I think are important about the North Carolina law is if you are virally suppressed, law enforcement cannot put their hand on you in any way. And we all know that once that hand touches somebody, people can be rushed into plea agreements, lots of bad things can happen before there's ever even a trial. So that's one notable thing that I think is important about North Carolina. And the other is, as I said, this is a tender, complicated, difficult conversation to be having, and I speak as a person who does not carry the virus. I'm always very cognizant of that and everything I say about this. But if the law in Idaho were the same as what they accomplished in North Carolina, Carrie Thomas would not be in prison right now. So I want to thank the North Carolina panel and thank you for all your great work. And we're going to now move right into the next panel. We're running a little late on time. Thank you all very much. Please, yes, please.
So the chill you just felt go through this room was the realization from these AIDS activists that although improved, the North Carolina law has a different set of circumstances for those who are undetectable and HIV positive and those who are not. That clearly bothered people, and yet the activists were trying to explain, yes, but at least we got the law improved for people who are undetectable and pose no risk to other people. It's a very thorny issue, isn't it?
Yeah, it's basically principles versus realpolitik and being pragmatic, and it's something that we wrestle with constantly, and I think it's really important that we've heard these two very different stories, both of which are being seen as success stories here in the US, of the modernization in California, which really changes the law quite dramatically to a misdemeanor, and there's no difference whether you're on treatment or not, to a very liberal state in the West, and here's a southern state where the law itself was within a public health law, and you can see that there were many compromises that needed to be made.
And so it's a tale of two states. You had California, who had the best possible environment in which to make change, and they made sweeping change, the best we could hope for. And then you have North Carolina, who was working in a conservative environment and kind of had to cut the baby in half and say, okay, we are going to save those who are undetectable from prosecution, and maybe down the road come back for the rest.
Yeah, so I mean, Laurel's question, particularly the second part about, okay, if the state is going to do that, the state then needs to have the responsibility to ensure that everyone who needs good health care actually achieves it. That's a really important part of it in terms of, don't leave the responsibility again down to the individual. So it's like, okay, if you're going to do that, then let's make sure that at least everyone who wants to be on treatment and who wants to get to undetectable actually can do that.
So using it as leverage to make the state actually make sure that they improve services. Okay, our next panel is about to begin, which includes actual elected officials in a room of AIDS activists. What could possibly go wrong? Thanks. We'll turn it back to the panel.
Great. Thank you, everybody. Is the microphone working okay? Yes. Okay, good. And I know we're already behind, but before I introduce our panel and get to this, I want to offer sort of one additional thought on the Supreme Court ruling that was just announced. While we did not get the ruling that many of us fought for and sought, understand they were not ruling on, it's a very narrow case-specific ruling. And there are things to celebrate in this. They reaffirmed the core principle that businesses open to the public must be open to all, as the ACLU just stated in their statement. So I just wanted to clarify that, because a lot of people in here, we go back to our communities and we share on this. No, we didn't get the ruling we wanted, but it reaffirmed that core principle. And what the reason we didn't get the ruling we wanted was because the court found that the appeal in Colorado, some of the members of that appeal board or commission had expressed some comments about religious stuff that they didn't think that the baker got a fair hearing at that level in Colorado. So with that clarification, I want to introduce our panel. We have on my far left Representative John McCrosty, who's a state representative in Idaho, and has been just an amazing champion for the Idaho Coalition, and we're so happy to have you here. In the middle, we have Representative John Hoadley from Michigan, who's also been an amazing champion. Even before he got elected to the legislature, John was working on this issue, so that's how committed he is. And I know you're flying right back to Lansing today. Their legislature's in session, so it really means a lot that he's here. And to my immediate right, we have former Missouri State Representative Jeanette Mott Oxford, better known as JMO. Jeanette was the first openly queer legislator in Missouri. That's correct, right? Oh, wait a minute.
I was the first female partnered with a female running for office in Missouri. There was one out gay man before me.
Okay, there we go. And now heads Empower Missouri, which is a 110-year-old progressive policy and advocacy group in Missouri that I wish every state had one just like it. With that, we're going to talk a little bit about some of the, the famous saying, and someone referenced it earlier, that there are two things the public should never see being made: sausages and laws. So we're going to talk a little bit about some of that behind-the-scenes stuff. And I'm going to throw out several sort of questions to start with, and then maybe I'll give a directed one, and feel free to engage with each other. We've already had a discussion up here about whether the Idaho legislature pays for printing the cards or they have to get them printed individually. This is the things that legislators discuss when they're together. And some of the questions that came up is, what makes a legislator choose to take on any given issue? Where does that come from? What defines a good community partner? How do we do, and we've had this in a number of states where we've been concerned about getting involved in some cases, because what if we lose control of that process? What if we open up the bill and it goes off in a bad direction and the legislator's not returning our call? Because they don't have to deal with us. I'd like to hear some stories of some of the behind-the-scenes stuff. If Tammy Haught was up here, if Senator Matt McCoy was up here, you would say that what actually ended up a key part of passing the bill in Iowa had nothing to do with HIV. It had to do with a bill involving insurance on corporate farms. And there was horse trading that went on. That's the legislative process. And then the role of relationships, individual relationships, getting that legislator who's not an ally, not a likely ally, not a usual suspect, but you've got a good relationship with, and you can get his ears open and talk to him and get that person to come around. So with that, I want to start with a complicated question, I think. How do you deal with a circumstance when, on a specific issue, there are different voices coming from the community most directly concerned about that issue, right? And on this issue, we don't all agree. We have situations in states where we don't agree. So as legislators, presently and past, how do you deal with that? And let's just start with John and come across here.
Wow. So, with the limited experience that I have in the legislature so far, I just finished my second term. There can be some neutralizing effects. I mean, you can kill a bill even within your own community if you can't come to a consensus. One of the things that we've seen in trying to update our human rights, civil rights laws, is truly the ability to compromise. Is it 4 words, nothing more, nothing less, or where is the place that we can compromise? And at this point, where you had a lot of movement on an issue, that's neutralized that issue at this point. It's going to be a challenge to get that moving forward again.
Yeah, so first, so good to be back. It was nice seeing many of you at Grinnell. Sorry I missed the last one, but I'm excited to be here. This idea of difference in the coalition can be really difficult, particularly when you're moving ahead on an issue that is not 100% smooth sailing all the time. So one thing that we found that was really important to Michigan is that we set some coalition guiding principles. So we have 3 key principles that we operate on. One of the hard things is that we're not going to get everything we want as we take this first wave of trying to modernize the law. The question, though, is making sure that we're never conceding ground that would be in violation of one of those principles. And so I think that's one of the hardest pieces. And then, what we need, though, is, and this is why communication in the first, the victories from California, I thought were really instructive, because we need to be able to make decisions, know folks that there's some sort of accountability within the community that's the most infected by those decisions, and then communicate those to the various stakeholders to explain the why we got to what we got, even if it's not everything we hope to get, if that makes sense.
Microphone, sure.
Yeah, we're still in midstream in Missouri. We've just had 2 bills introduced that will have new numbers next year, but one by a very conservative rural Republican and one by a suburban progressive Democrat. And one of them is definitely better than the other one. You can probably guess which one is better than the other one. But on the other hand, the Republican asked the Democrat to sponsor the bill to try to pull her bill over. She said, this is an election year where some of my colleagues will try to run on a law and order platform about my bill, and I'll be attacked by other Republicans about this. In fact, she asked us not to have a World AIDS Day press conference about it. Originally, we wanted her to file it on December 1st, the first day that you can file legislation in Missouri, and she said, I'll get hit by other Republicans if you do that. So, yes, there is some differences about how we see things among the Missouri HIV Justice Coalition, but we always try to announce a conference call where we'll go over the alternatives and discuss what to do about it, and folks did vote to support both of the bills in a call before before the bills were filed. So we tried to make sure that we could have a discussion about it, but you also got to be nimble because things happen quickly. So we can't always manage to plan a month and ahead to get everybody together and look at stuff, because bills get drafted and redrafted and redrafted, and you announce the call, and anybody that can manage to get on it, you have it, is kind of what we've been doing. It's maybe not ideal, but it's the political reality.
And Scott, I think Shadis referred to that in California, in this challenge of how in a state do we create the group that is involved day to day, and when those decisions have to be made very quickly. We did have a circumstance where, there was a call that went out to everybody, and about a week later, we got an upset email from somebody. Well, you didn't give us enough time for the call. Well, we had about 6 hours to get back to the legislator on it. We didn't have time that way. These are all Democrats up here, but in a number of states we've had many Republicans, and sometimes surprisingly so, supporting our effort. I'd like to if maybe you could tell us just a story, if not on HIV criminalization, on another issue where you brought in an unexpected ally on the other side of the aisle.
So Idaho's kind of unique. So we're clearly a conservative state, and the Democrats are in the minority party. And our Republicans, because they are so big, they're actually split into two factions. And you have a more moderate wing and you have a more extreme right, Tea Party type wing. And it's really kind of fun to play both sides to the middle and to be that swing when they can't come to an agreement. That's just, there's your strong example of the importance of solidarity. They can't keep it together. Well, you know, I'm going to work with the faction that gets me there. I've got one of the reasons why I'm so excited to try to get this legislation forward in Idaho is that I know that I have allies on the moderate side and on the Tea Party side, and by getting them at least on the same page on my issue, and I'm not going to call it a Democratic issue, this should be a bipartisan or even nonpartisan issue, supporting everybody's health and safety. By bringing both sides to the table, this is our key to getting this through.
You know, I'm trying to think of some examples of where we've had interesting crossover. And you know, one thing to know about like the legislature and the legislative process is that you operate in a fishbowl, and so the relationships that you build between legislators actually matters a lot. And the fact that we oftentimes are being told information at the last minute, and you have to make decisions. And so, you know, the relationship you build with folks is really important because you may be operating on 50% information before you have to cast a vote sometimes. And so, you know, I say that because one thing that I think a lot of the most successful legislators that I've watched have done a really good job of building those relationships across the aisle, and they're going to be on things that you don't think are a big deal. But, you know, one of those examples is I was originally, when we were looking at our our modernization bills, we thought they were going to go to a different committee. So we specifically started to do some work at building relationships with the members of the policy committee that we thought it would be sent to. And you know what was interesting is that we were talking about things like auto insurance rates. We were talking about things like frustrations with the roads in their neck of the woods as a way to sort of build some common ground to show that, you know, the Democrat across the aisle is not scary and we agree on the same things. And let's talk about why modernizing the HIV law is actually important to you and the things that you care about too. And so, you know, what was interesting is every legislator that we talked to had a story about someone in their life touched by HIV. One thing I will note, though, is many of those stories sort of ended in the mid-90s. And so one of the biggest things that we were overcoming with in our neck of the woods was the fact that we needed to continue the story that many of them didn't realize there was additional chapters that they needed to read. And that's, by the way, I'll just note why the stories of people living with HIV is so important in the lobbying effort. But, you know, that's the kind of thing I think about when I brought people on the other together. You know, then you listen to these stories, you see where they're coming from, and then you try to align those values. And it, you know, turns out it also helps then, we just had, from those relationships, we were just updating our Indigent Defense Commission work in the state of Michigan, which you might not think has a lot of parallels here. But because of those relationships working on modernizing HIV, we were able to also then fix a bunch of the problems with the bills that were introduced on indigent defense. So, you know, there's a lot of ways that you can bring people across. Relationships are key.
Yeah, they are. Empower Missouri has been around since 1901. We formed as the Missouri Conference on Charities and Corrections. So we have a long history of trying to find a path forward no matter who's in power, right? Because it changes all the time. So we did recruit Republican sponsors this year for legislation that we were able to move forward, like raise the age to get most 17-year-olds out of adult courts and prisons. That passed this year. And not just passed, but 139 to 4 in the House and 32 to 1 in the Senate, when 4 years ago we couldn't get out of committee. So you've got to grind it out year after year. We probably have faced some criticism from our own supporters and donors about picking Holly Rader to sponsor this bill, because she's our enemy on other things. She's horrible on reproductive health. She's terrible on labor. But she grew up the child of addicts, and she sponsors an a needle and syringe exchange bill that got out of the House by a very strong vote this year, and unfortunately got stalled out in the Senate because of Senator David Sater, who doesn't understand it, and he's just problematic on so many things. He's also the big leader of the so-called work requirements for people on SNAP, which is really work documentation for people who are already desperately poor and don't have time to be sending you copies of their work hours all the time. We were urged to find a Republican who was pro-choice and pro-labor and pro-environment, but it's kind of hard to find one in Missouri that meets that description. So we worked with who we had, who was somebody that understands addiction at a deep level and was already trying to modernize HIV, laws that reduce harm around HIV with needle and syringe exchange bills. The relationship piece is important. I wasn't sure if Holly recognizes that I'm, a person who's been with a female partner for 34 years, and that she might abandon our cause because she's so well known for her fundamentalist Christian roots. So I bothered to come out to her in the process to make sure she wouldn't pull the plug on sponsoring. During the conversation with her, I'm also a member of the United Church of Christ and went to seminary, came out on a seminary campus, and was refused ordination over that. So in my conversation with her, I said, I'm very active in my church and faith is very important to me, but some people can't say that I can't be Christian because I'm partnered with a woman. And she said, I'm not one of those people. So I discovered something about Holly Rader during that conversation, but I wanted to make sure she wasn't going to back out of working with us on this issue if somebody told her later, because just because I think I'm just queer as hell and everybody gets it, people write stories about me all the time, in their own mind based on what they think the world is like. So.
So one lesson I learned early on when dealing with the legislator is don't try and convince them you're right. Try and make your position important to them. In Iowa, and lots of you have heard me tell that story, in a lobby day where the Tammy and her group, they had the lasagna and Caesar salad in the rotunda, and the legislators came out of each chamber, and this was, in lots of state capitals, this is what happens, right? They get their free lunch, but they got to listen to you. And so we had people who knew the legislators. Oh, that's Senator so-and-so. She's a nurse. You're a nurse. You go talk to her. Oh, that's a representative. He's from Osceola County. You're from Osceola County. You go talk to them. The ones we had nothing on, nothing at all, go up and say, excuse me, Senator, do you have children? This is not the question they're asking as they're getting their Caesar salad. And most of them do, and most of them are willing to acknowledge it. Then we say, what we're proposing will put your children at less risk of acquiring HIV or other sexually transmitted infections. And that just sort of turned it upside down, and they're like, what do you mean? And opened up the conversation. I also can't help but notice that, you hear what John said? That he saw that so many legislators' opinions and information about this kind of ended around 1995. You know what else ended around 1995? Our presence in the state capitals. From the first days of the epidemic until about the mid-90s, people with AIDS and people with HIV were going to the capitals themselves all the time. And for all sorts of reasons, and I'm not talking about blame here, but for all sorts of reasons, that presence went away. And the service providers were still going there, but their priorities were different, right? They're trying to keep their doors open. They need funding. They're talking about formulas. So they're not taking on the human rights or bodily autonomy or stigma, privacy, confidentiality issues. So that went away. That's what we've been building over the last 5 or 10 years. That's what the resurgence of networks of people with HIV and building these coalitions has brought back to the legislatures. And it is paying off. I had somebody say, oh my God, all this work and you've only changed it in 3 states or 4 states or whatever. You have no idea the effect this is having in state after state in creating these relationships. Sorry, I'm not a very good moderator because you give me the microphone. So, what makes for a good community partner? So we're all trying to be community partners, and we want the legislator to see us as helpful. And you know, I remember one conversation with the legislator where he said, you know, you got to get your act together. I can't solve your problems. I can't bring you together. I'm only going to talk to one organization, you know, and sort of put it back on us. But what makes a good community partner?
I'm looking at you, Kevin. You know, in our particular coalition, it's the fact that that Kevin is incredibly organized. He has nonstop energy. Y'all will be lucky to have a Kevin in your state. I know that you have a Kevin in your state. Just don't take mine. But I feel very lucky to be working with someone like Kevin that, you know, like I say, has that energy, has those organizational skills, has the people skills. Had he not approached me about the issue, I can't tell you that I would be involved. He is that driving force. So without that, I can't say that I would be here today, let alone involved.
Sure. Well, I hope that Empower Missouri is a good community partner for people living with HIV on this issue because we are an organization that doesn't believe in policy just for theoretical or intellectual, you know, satisfaction that, hey, this is good policy, but that we see every issue as an embodied issue, that it's about the people who are impacted by it, and that you should never be about us without us when you are doing your work. We also do connect the dots between this issue and many other issues. While Ashley and I are here today, other staff members of Empower Missouri are putting on press conferences today because our Attorney General releases the vehicle stops report about law enforcement and racial profiling on June 1st of every year. So today we are having press conferences in St. Louis and Jefferson City talking about the disparities in policing, that people of color are 85% more likely to be stopped by police in Missouri, and that they're much more apt to be asked for a consent search, a drug dog search, or to be arrested for resisting arrest. So we do look at on other issues and connect the dots between those issues. We think that is very important as well, and we think that our longevity, that we have learned some lessons over the 117 years that we've been working to reform our laws in Missouri towards social justice is helpful, because we have wins from the past that can inform some things that we do now, as well as we have created a reputation for ourselves as folks that try to be a conscience for our state, and as folks who are willing to work in a way that's not about getting credit, but getting things done that actually improve the health of our community.
So we'll have just 5 minutes for questions, so if you want to go ahead and line up for that, and while people are lining up with any questions they have at the microphones in the front here, I want to ask something about language, how you speak about this issue with other legislators. We've had kind of an ongoing discussion among activists around the word decriminalization. And I keep hearing from legislators, or I've heard from several legislators, they don't like to use decriminalization because in the legislatures, that word is typically associated with decriminalization of marijuana. And it's like giving people some sort of right that had been denied them. But on the other hand, we're trying to decriminalize a lot of things about a lot of bodies and a lot of people. So I'm just curious if you have any comments on that.
Well, just one thing I would add on language then is that, know your audience, right? So Michigan is a Republican majority state. The governor is the Republican. The Senate is a supermajority of Republicans, and the House is a majority of Republicans. So just like I think all communities want to use language that is respectful and language that's created by that community. My Republican colleagues have language, and the language that they oftentimes are using are things like modernization, reform. They talk about they don't talk about decriminalization as much. They talk about like cutting regulations, cutting red tape. So when we're talking about these issues, we try to then balance both the language that the communities that are impacted by the law use and the decision makers on this law, which don't always overlap exactly, that they're using. So that's, we're using a lot of those sort of reform, modernization, regulatory change.
Yeah, I would agree with that, and what I would add is that it is also dependent upon the relationship that you have with a particular colleague, and that can go with either side of the aisle. Part of that might have to do with age. As I've talked to younger Republicans, I can use decriminalization with them. And that's okay because they get it, and we are on the same page. With older Republicans, I can't do that, and that same thing has seemed to have held true with folks in my own caucus as well. So, know your audience and know the relationship that you have.
We've also opted for modernization and stressed that our current laws are medically inaccurate because we want people to understand that there's stuff written into the Missouri Code that's actually not scientifically true, and that they should care about that. So it's the language that we've opted for, but we're certainly not backing away from the fact that we're criminalizing people. And in fact, one of the people that testified at our hearing in early May was Rob, a man who served 9 years, and whose testimony the person chairing the committee that day said was absolutely riveting. Rob did a little moment of theater at the beginning. They had been talking about all these meds that people on, well, they were using really atrocious language, right? These legislators they hadn't read our list of how you should talk. So they were talking about how people with AIDS, take a lot of meds or whatever. So Rob said, could I get a glass of water as he was starting to talk? He said, I'm a little nervous about being here. Oh, and it's time to take my pill. So he took his pill and he said, that's the only pill I take each day. So he gave them a little lesson while he was at it.
Do we have some questions? Nana, up here? Yeah.
Yeah, so thank you all for being here. Thank you for what you do in your states individually. The question I have is really based on a system of care that impacts all of us, which is the Ryan White Care Act. And, looking at that system, the Ryan White Care Act was actually what put these criminalization laws on the books in every state. And what do we do to look at this systemic issue when it comes to the Ryan White Care Act and this mandate of, getting federal dollars for this program, that you have to have criminalization laws in place within your state? Are we looking at some of the root causes of why that is what it is?
So that was the original Ryan White Care Act that required that states could demonstrate that they could prosecute intentional transmission and so on, that prompted a lot of states to pass these statutes to qualify for the funding. That requirement was lifted in subsequent reauthorizations of Ryan White. But what we need now is to attach to some federal funding stream the states demonstrate that their laws are scientifically valid with best public health practice to incent them to take that out. Other questions? Devin, right here.
Hey, thank you. So one of my biggest criticisms has been around process. Can you all explain what your process is for building consensus, and if you determine beforehand what? Yeah, can you elaborate on your process for building consensus? That's something that I've taken issue with.
Building consensus within the community.
Yes, specifically. Thank you for catching that.
Okay. And I think probably most legislators will say that's not their job. They'll say that's the community's job, but I would guess, but feel free to speak to that.
So, I mean, that's Kevin's job, and that's what I let him do. And I'm sorry to put that much on you, Kevin, but thank you. I do feel like my job as the legislator is I need to build my numbers so that I can get my bill out of committee, that I can get it through the House floor, and do the same thing on the Senate side and make sure that the governor's going to sign it. I feel like that's my role. And the other elements are the coalition's duties, and I can't do all of that.
And I will note, right, this is like one of the most classic problems with legislation, in the sense that, on any issue, if we're talking about labor unions may be divided. If we're talking about reproductive justice organizations may have different points. And so that is not unique or different to this bill. But one thing I will know, right, is that you do your best to try to engage coalitions that do this work, which is why having strong state-level coalitions is so critically important, and building the relationship so your voices then are included in that legislative process. One other big thing to note, though, is that the Schoolhouse Rock version of how a bill becomes a law isn't how it works at all, right? And we all know that in this room. We're sophisticated, right? But we love it. But the problem with that then is that many states use things like Mason's Rules of Order that really shut down minority voice. Yes. So a lot of times, if you're working with a legislator that's in the minority, such as myself in Michigan, or a lot of us that are doing the work in red states, and maybe we have a Democratic sponsor for the bill, the ability to insert ourselves in the process may not be ideally the way we want it to be. So I just flag it that I think there's an accountability role that has to happen from obviously the folks that are most impacted. And the more that you can build a relationship to influence the process or see where it's coming from, I think at least the shared frustration will be evident then.
Hi, this is Scott. And I guess this might not be a question so much for this panel, but it's an issue that I think we need to grapple with. And I'm wondering if we can find a place, to do this. And maybe we've already got it built to the program. I haven't studied it enough. But this idea of incrementalism versus, sort of that bill without compromise. And I don't have an answer here. I just want to make clear. And I believe that there are places where compromise is going to be necessary to move the ball forward, but I'm at the same time concerned about, well, what it is we think is going to be the impetus for taking the next steps. Because we have a movement that we're building on modernization. So once you've modernized the law, I'm not sure how you come back and now make a case. Like, if nothing's changed since you last modernized the law. So I think that's something we need to grapple with and not place sort of pipe dreams on the idea of we're going to come back and fix it when that might not be really very possible. So I'm wondering if you have any thoughts about what it would be as how you might move something in a next step sort of scenario, or if that's...
I can give one real life example of, is that Missouri got rid of its some laws about gay sex, basically, that were on the books, even though they had been invalidated by a Supreme Court decision, by just quietly doing it in a huge omnibus bill and not bringing up that it happened. So sometimes you do it very quietly, and is that satisfying exactly? Not exactly. But on the other hand, it did get it off the books. So there are ways to get rid of things later, and often they're very quiet kind of strategies where you get a powerful committee chair that understands the issue to work with you on that. I certainly want society to be totally transformed, and I work for that every day. As someone said earlier, even if we win the Holly Rader version of the bill instead of the Tracy McCreary version of the bill, a whole lot of people won't go to prison who would have otherwise, and that would be a good thing. I will not be satisfied, however, until it looks like the Tracy McCreary version. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Can I just add real quick? I think that at least for us, I feel like we need to take our biggest chomp at the apple while we have the opportunity. If we don't get the whole apple, we've got to do what we can, because at least as far as the decriminalization piece, we're not going to get another swipe at that. Now, can we come back later and maybe look at organ donation? Maybe so, and maybe we don't have to do that this time. There's your opportunity for incrementalism, but take your biggest bite at the apple while you have the chance.
Okay, and the Mississippi PL/HIV Coalition gets the last question.
Thank you. It's okay, I'm going to ask a very real question. Not every state has the luxury of having a lot of Democrats in office or progressives. I'm in Mississippi. I'm very conservative, white, older male delegation. And we're in a situation when we speak to them, they've moved past it being a gay issue, but quite frankly, they look at this now as a black issue. So I'm curious what language or advice you would have for states that are in conservative areas that we could move past the gay, the black, this is a human issue, because I can't tell you how many times I've sat in meetings and going into the meeting, they didn't know that I had HIV, and halfway through it, I'd be asked, well, why do you care? And when they found out I had HIV, then I got, well, how could you do that? Or, the language turns to now I'm being punished by them. So I know there has to be someone else in the audience that's gone through this. So what advice do you have for us to speak into more of the conservative members of our houses?
Here's my advice. You need to run for office. Get in the legislature. So, no one, and I'm not a person living with HIV, but those of you who live with HIV, it is your voice that needs to be at the table. And when your voice is at the table, you're not on the menu anymore. Bring those voices of diversity, which includes, regardless of what the protected classes are, get your voice at the table.
And that running for office is a great piece of advice. And if I can, I'd like to close the panel at that point so I can get people to lunch.
My thunder was stolen a little bit, but I was going to say we have a number of openly HIV positive elected officials. I'm one of them. I'm mayor of Milford, Pennsylvania. But much more important, the president of the New York City Council, Corey Johnson, is openly positive. The mayor pro tem of West Hollywood, California, John D'Amico, is openly HIV positive. The former mayor and present member of the City Council in West Hollywood, John Duran, is openly HIV positive. And there's another mayor in California, I can't remember his name. And 2 years from now, at HIV is Not a Crime 2020, we want some positive legislators up here. And let me tell you, there are an awful lot of people in elected office who never thought about running for elected office until the day they did, and then they got elected. Thank you to our fantastic panels. You're incredible allies. You're inspiring. We're grateful. And thank you.
Bravo indeed. A couple of announcements. If you signed up to be a facilitator, please see Tammy right up here.
Thank you.
We have heard some concerns about staff conversations that folks thought.
Well, we just got our marching orders from Sean Strub, and that is if you're HIV positive and you feel strongly about issues like this or any issues in your community, you should run for office, and we should see more politicians at this next conference who are actually living with HIV. So you've been watching the live stream of HIV is Not a Crime at Indiana University, brought to you by the HIV Justice Network on behalf of HIV Justice Worldwide. We will return to you at 3 o'clock, where we'll be discussing the meaningful involvement of people with HIV, those who are leading this, as well as with an interview with the always dynamic Max Boykin of the Black AIDS Institute. So we'll see you back here at 3 o'clock Eastern Time. Thanks a lot.
So Max is our interview.